Chapter 7 of Julia Ried. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 7, in which is a troubled Sunday. I had serious time dressing for church the next morning. It was the first time I ever remember to have had very earnest thoughts about the matter of dress. I had been, perhaps, fortunate in that respect, having very little variety in my wardrobe to choose from, and very little time to spend in choosing. I think the first thing that led me astray on this particular morning was the absence of family worship. I had always been accustomed to it in my home, for many years, with Dr. Van Anden to lead us; and after he and Dr. Douglass both went away, we had met in my mother's room, mother, Alfred and I, and Alfred had been the leader. On this morning I lingered downstairs after breakfast, missing this morning service as only those can who, having been accustomed to it all their lives, find themselves suddenly adrift in the world without it. I lingered talking with Mrs. Tyndall, not in a particularly Sabbath strain, until Dr. Douglass, passing through the hall, warned me of the lateness of the hour. This, too, was a surprise. I had been used to long Sabbath mornings in my mother's home. I went upstairs and began that business of dressing at once. My hair was refractory at first, or I was over particular, and the first bell rang before it was in order. Then I donned my brown alpaca dress, and felt satisfied with it until I suddenly remembered that I had worn it for a traveling dress. True, I had only traveled 10 miles, but what of that? Had not Mrs. Tyndall complimented me on my taste and propriety of my traveling attire? I hurried it back to the clothes press, with a nervous feeling that I had a reputation for good taste to sustain, and selected next my one silk dress, plain black, made neatly and simply, but undeniably my very best dress. It had been a gift from Sadie, Dr. Van Anden, and dear brother Alfred, the latter having saved his pocket money for months to add to what Sadie called the Julia Silk Dress Fund. I looked exceedingly well in it, I told myself, as I enjoyed the luxury of a full-length survey of myself. Next I added real lace collars and cuffs, Cousin Abby's gifts when Sadie was married; but I finally returned them to their box, feeling some way that I looked unlike myself and church, and selected a plain linen band and cuffs. Even with them I had trouble. I tried a pink bow before I remembered that the bird's wing in my gray felt hat was as blue as the sky. I discarded that and tried a blue one, but it was so different a blue from the wing on my hat, that I, remembering the green velvet bonnet that was to sit before us, and Mrs. Tyndall's horror, hastily took it off and clasped my collar with a plain gold pin. Meantime the bell tolled and tolled, and the more I hurried the more exasperatingly it seemed to toll. My Bible lay unopened on the table, and I had had no time for a word of prayer that morning; at least I told myself so, choosing to ignore the time spent in the parlor after breakfast. I had never been to church on Sabbath morning without first having at least the form of private prayer. I kneeled down hastily and tried to collect my thoughts, but I remember that while I knelt I unclasped the pin that fastened my watch chain, and drew the chain outside of my cloak. It was a handsome chain, and I did not want it hidden. Then Dr. Douglass knocked at my door, and called out that it was quite late, and there was a long walk to take. I sprang up hastily, ran to the glass, and, I am thankful to be able to say, changed my mind about the chain, and hid it under my cloak, donned my gray hat, drew on my gray gloves that exactly matched the hat, and, on the whole, felt satisfied with my appearance. The church was larger and handsomer than any I had ever attended, and the grand organ rolled its music through the house as we went down the aisle. It thrilled and solemnized me. I began to realize that it was the Sabbath day, and that we had come to worship the King in his beauty. There was no green bonnet in the seat in front of us, but there were 3 neatly dressed little girls and a manly boy. I found myself taking particular note of their dress, and thinking that I saw no very marked indications of uncultivated taste after all. I liked their faces; they looked bright and fresh. I could not help thinking that they must have a good mother. The voluntary from choir and organ was very impressive, and my heart seemed solemnized to worship when Dr. Mulford arose. At first I did not notice the peculiar quiver to his lips of which Mrs. Tyndall had spoken, nor did I take in the sense of what hymn he was reading until I caught a glance of Mrs. Tyndall's eyes. There was that in the glance which seemed to carry me back to her parlor, and cause me to see and hear again the ludicrous description that she had given me of Dr. Mulford's reading. It was then I noticed that the hymn was the same, "When I survey the wondrous cross." I began to give close attention to Dr. Mulford, and noticed presently a nervous quiver of the upper lip, like the twitching of a nerve. Even then it did not impress me as being particularly ludicrous, and more because I felt that Mrs. Tyndall expected me to than for any necessity therefore, I smiled. But presently, as I allowed my thoughts to rest upon her description, there suddenly burst over me a vivid scene of her extremely comical appearance, and I laughed outright. Mrs. Tyndall by this time was perfectly grave, with eyes bent on her book. I felt frightened to think that I had laughed in church. I wondered if it had really been aloud, so the people could hear me. Then a sort of hysterical feeling came over me, that feeling which no mortal who has not been guilty of laughing, and continuing to laugh, in exactly the wrong place, need attempt to understand. I tried in vain to regain my dignity. I thought of every serious thing I had ever heard of. I tried to imagine what my mother would think if she knew her daughter were guilty of such unbecoming behavior. I thought of all the little Mulfords in front of me, and of the example that I was setting them, and it was all of no sort of use. I laughed again, not aloud, but that distressing inward laughter that shakes one's body to a jelly, that shakes the seat and the footstool on which are other feet than yours, a kind of a laughter that no one within 20 feet of you can be ignorant of. In vain I choked and pretended to cough, and drew my face into very uncommon lengths of severe gravity, only to burst forth again into uncontrollable shakings and gigglings. My one comfort in looking back on my folly is, that there was not a bit of mirth about the laugh. It just originated in a silly schoolgirl lack of self-control. No, not originated. I could have avoided the very first inclination to laugh, had not Mrs. Tyndall's face seemed to expect it, and I been anxious to please her. Very suddenly, at last, was I sobered, not by resolution nor contrition, but by indignation. Dr. Douglass, sitting beside me, bent forward and gravely whispered, "Shall I give you an opportunity to pass out?" A vision of Mr. Tyndall and Dr. Douglass politely rising, and myself brushing past them and marching down the aisle, my face as red as the carpet on which I trod, burst suddenly upon me. I wonder that I did not laugh again at that, but it instantly sobered me. I raised my flushed and indignant face, and turning quite away from the doctor, gave undivided and grave attention to Dr. Mulford. He was just announcing his text. I opened my little Bible, as was my wont, and marked and dated the text. I have just taken that Bible and found the words, "What will ye? Shall I come unto you with a rod or in love?" I had no difficulty in remaining grave and dignified during the rest of the service, partly through shame and anger, and partly because of my interest in the sermon that followed. It must have been a forcible one, for there are certain portions of it that I remember vividly today. I remained for the Sabbath school service, and had a seat in Mrs. Tyndall's class. She introduced me to several young misses in rustling silks and many flounces. My little Ruth was the only one that I had seen before. I nodded and smiled at her, and was shocked to find that I was the only one who in any way recognized her, save Mrs. Tyndall, who gave her a cold bow. I felt that little Ruth was decidedly out of her element, and was sorry for her. I looked over to Dr. Douglass's class. Frank Hooper was there, and several others, Ruth's companions. If I had not been angry at the doctor, I should have motioned him to me and proposed an immediate change, thereby relieving Ruth and her teacher. But what I was pleased to call his insufferable impertinence could not so soon be overlooked. I remember very little about the lesson. I failed to become interested. But after the question book forms were gone through with, and Bibles closed, I remember an animated discussion that ensued concerning the getting up of tableaux for a certain festival which was to be held about Christmas time. Mrs. Tyndall gave minute descriptions of the style of dress needed to personate certain characters, and I suddenly became an object of importance, because I had not only seen, but participated in one of the tableaux mentioned, and could give accurate information as to whether the young lady who personated religion should dress in white or black. Miss Florence Hervey, the most supercilious young lady of all that supercilious clique, and who evidently had been almost inclined to ignore me, seemed suddenly to decide on patronage instead, and asked innumerable questions, even whispering them at intervals during the closing prayer, and said, as we were passing out: "I shall call on you, Miss Ried. My engagements are so many, that I call on very few strangers, but I shall make you an exception." Then she turned and addressed her teacher: "Mrs. Tyndall, I really think it is insufferable having that Walker girl in our class. What makes you endure it?" Lucia Simmons responded: "Nonsense, Flo, what do you care? I'm sure she is as quiet as a little brown kitten. I think it's refreshing to look at her meek face." And Mrs. Tyndall, with her sweetest smile and gentle voice, added: "You know we must not be respecters of persons in Sabbath school, my dear Florence." "Oh, now, Mrs. Tyndall, that's all very well for you to say, of course, but it is useless to expect the same amount of perfection in us. We never expect to attain to your standard, and she makes us positively uncomfortable." I looked steadily at Miss Florence, but could not determine whether or not this sentence savored of sarcasm. If Mrs. Tyndall thought so, she did not make it visible, but answered thoughtfully: "To be sure, the poor girl seems rather out of her element. My dear, do you think the doctor would take her?" Before I could respond, the doctor joined us, and with a grave bow to the young ladies, addressed their teacher: "Mrs. Tyndall, my girls say you have one of their friends in your class, Miss Walker. Is she properly classified?" Mrs. Tyndall laughed. "Ask Miss Hervey," she said playfully; and Miss Hervey, nothing daunted, responded promptly: "Indeed, Dr. Douglass, she is my thorn in the flesh. She looks so entirely as if she had come out of the ark, that my mind is continually carried back to antediluvian times, to the great disadvantage of Moses and the Egyptians, about whom, you know, we are studying at present." Dr. Douglass's face relaxed not one muscle, and, with a grave bow, he merely said: "Mrs. Tyndall, I will speak to the superintendent about her," and left us. Miss Hervey's thoughts were thus turned into another channel. "How can you possibly exist with that man sitting at your table? Haven't you contracted the dyspepsia lately? I would quite as soon sit opposite my grandfather's monument." "Florence, you are a sad child," Mrs. Tyndall answered, with a slight laugh. "The doctor is worth a dozen ordinary gentlemen. Ask Miss Ried if it is not so." Then to me: "Come, my dear, shall we go?" Her last remark had instantly fixed a battery of eyes on me, and I know the wonder had been started as to what Miss Ried knew of Dr. Douglass. I learned long afterward that this was one of Mrs. Tyndall's quiet, ladylike ways of gossiping. The doctor had disappeared, but joined us just as we reached the piazza, and detained me with a question as Mrs. Tyndall passed in: "Julia, do you go to mission school with me this afternoon?" I turned a haughty, indignant face toward him, and spoke loftily: "Is that the only apology which you have to offer for your rudeness to me this morning?" He looked simply surprised, and spoke in his usual tone: "I have no apology of any sort to offer, Julia, for I certainly was not aware of an occasion. I saw you utterly unable to control yourself, and the wisest thing to do seemed to me to leave the church until you regained self-command." His composure angered me more than before, and I answered sharply: "You may look elsewhere for mission school help. I have no desire to accompany you." To this he made no sort of reply, only held open the door for me to pass in. While he awaited in the back parlor the summons to dinner, the door bell rang, and presently there sauntered in young Mr. Sayles. Sauntered is the only word which seemed to me to apply to Mr. Sayles' movements. His whole manner had an air of good-natured languor. "Will you give me some dinner?" he asked, as he dropped indolently into a chair. Boarding-house fare seemed to me insufferable to-day, to say nothing of boarding-house society. "Then you are still boarding away from home?" queried Mrs. Tyndall. Mr. Sayles shrugged his shoulders, then laughed lazily, and said: "Yes, Madame Sayles and I agree much better apart." "Poor fellow!" Mrs. Tyndall said, with a sympathetic sigh, and immediately we were summoned to dinner. Dr. Douglass, who came from his room at the bell call, greeted the visitor with a grave bow. The talk flowed on very pleasantly, but not in the least Sabbath-like. The doctor maintained an air of quiet dignity, joining in the conversation only when directly addressed. As Mr. Tyndall passed the dessert to his guest, he said: "Sayles, you scapegrace, where were you today? I didn't see you in church." "Probably not, as I wasn't there. I worshipped in a more primitive form." "Where and how?" Mr. Sayles glanced from Dr. Douglass to Mrs. Tyndall and myself, with a good humored laugh. "Do you want to disgrace me before this goodly number of orthodox people?" he asked, speaking lightly. "Well, if you are really anxious to know, I went toward the rising instead of the setting sun; more reasonable, you know, in the morning." Mrs. Tyndall looked shocked. "You went to the cathedral, you wicked man!" she exclaimed in reproving tones. "Well, I can't agree with you, Mrs. Tyndall. I don't feel wicked in the least. On the contrary, I don't know when I have been so devotionally inclined as I was this morning. The music was glorious. I thought of you, Mrs. Tyndall. You would have enjoyed the chanting. How is it, Doctor? Isn't it right for one to follow the bent of his nature in choosing his place of worship?" "One may safely follow his conscience, I think, in this as in other matters, provided he has carefully educated that conscience to the best of his knowledge and ability." The doctor's voice was courteous but grave toned, and Mr. Sayles responded as usual with a laugh, when he added: "And provided he has one, you ought to have said. I have never become quite sure on that point as yet. But come now, Tyndall, what did you gain by attending church this morning? Give an account of your impressions." CHAPTER 8. Recording by Trisha G.